I was a pretty talented student. I knew I was very smart somehow. On the other hand, I was very careless. So I sometimes screw up arithmetic tests just because I did it too fast or sloppily. But I liked everything about it. I liked everything about math. I loved learning the formulas for the volume of a sphere, 4/3 pi r cubed. I always thought that was a great formula. When I got to high school, we started with, plane geometry, proofs and theorems. That's where I really got gripped. I really loved that.
That was the voice of Jim Simons. Jim just recently died at the age of 86. Now, some listeners may know who Jim is, others might not. First and foremost, he was a mathematician. Jim made some celebrated discoveries in the 1970s, the most famous being something called Chern-Simons forms. But he then started dabbling in the finance markets, applying mathematical techniques and data analysis. And I think it's fair to say he was pretty successful. At the helm of a hedge fund called Renaissance Technologies, Jim amassed incredible wealth. At the time of his death, he was reported to be worth about $31 billion. That would make him the 51st richest person in the world for those who like to keep count. For those of you hoping to hear stories of super yachts and private jets and behind-the-scenes billionaire gossip, well, you're in luck. We're going to have some of that. But to get there, what we really need to delve into is Jim's philanthropy, because from the 1990s onwards, he became most well known for giving away his money. Jim and his wife Marilyn started the Simons Foundation, pouring literally billions of dollars into mathematical and science projects. Now, I couldn't possibly list them all, but I will mention 3 because they're specially related to today's guests. First, the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute, MSRI, that's in Berkeley. It's benefited greatly from Jim's generosity. In fact, it recently changed its name to the Simons-Laufer Mathematical Sciences Institute after a $70 million endowment from the families of Jim and his business partner, Henry Laufer. They call themselves SLMath for short. Secondly, the Flatiron Institute. This is an impressive research centre right in the heart of New York. Not surprisingly, it's right near the famed Flatiron Building. And lastly, Math for America, a project aimed at recruiting and retaining top school teachers by rewarding them with generous fellowships and other programs, giving teachers the VIP treatment Jim felt they so richly deserved. Now, the first person we're going to talk to now is John Ewing. John was head of the American Mathematical Society. Jim Simons was about to start Math for America, and he needed someone to run it.
I had known about him for years, of course. He was kind of famous in the background of mathematics. He called me up out of the blue and in typical Jim fashion said, we're looking for somebody to head this organization that I've started, Math for America. And do you know of anybody who might be interested in it? And we talked a little bit. Jim is, as you know, a really charming guy, and he wins you over almost immediately. It never occurred to me at the time that I myself might be interested in it, but obviously, in retrospect, it occurred to Jim. But this was his clever way of doing things, and I think he almost always ended up hiring people in the same way. The back end to the story is even more interesting because I sort of thought, maybe this isn't a crazy thing to do. I'd been there for 15 years at the AMS, and I thought maybe it's a nice thing to do at the end of my career. But then as I started looking into it deeply, I decided no, and I told Jim no. Jim never took no for an answer when he wanted the other way.
Right.
So he found out that I was going to a meeting in Brussels at the time. He was vacationing on his yacht, in his boat, in the Mediterranean. He flew his plane up to Brussels, insisted that I come down for a day and a half to be on his boat, flew me on his private jet. This was the first time I'd ever been on a private jet. Met me at the airport, took me onto the yacht. This incredible, the Archimedes is like nothing you've ever seen. And we spent the day kayaking, walking into Taormino. And anyway, it was beautiful. He led me to believe that this was the way things would always be in the job. That's not true, but
he wowed you.
He did. He wowed me. as I think he did everybody that he met, but in a really nice way. I mean, Jim, when you talk to Jim, he listened. He also had the habit of falling asleep in the afternoon, but he made you feel that he was listening to you. And so that's how I met him. So that was maybe 16 years ago. But from the beginning, I think we kind of bonded. For one thing, his secretary mentioned that we looked very much alike. We both were gray, bearded, white guys, and we kind of bonded right from the beginning.
You mentioned that he was a charming man. I only met him a few times, and he has sort of a gravelly, gruff voice. And maybe it was because I was a journalist, so therefore he had a different attitude towards me. But I always considered him quite sort of gruff and to the point. But you and other people have mentioned he loved telling jokes. He was quite a humorous guy.
He was one of the master joke tellers that I've ever met. I mean, or most masterful joke teller that I've ever met. He knew more jokes than anybody I've ever met. And yeah, his voice was a little gravelly, and I guess you could call him gruff, but he was gruff in the way that your grandfather is gruff sometimes, right? In a really nice way. And he certainly was direct. If he was thinking something, he'd tell you it. And in that sense, quite different from a lot of other very accomplished mathematicians that I've met in my life, that, he never talked to you indirectly somehow. He was always above board.
I feel like after we just mentioned Jim's voice, maybe we should hear it again. 9 years ago, I was lucky enough to do an interview with Jim. The full recording's available on YouTube. I'll link to that. But here's a clip.
I think that luck played a role. I was in the right place at the right time. But I think what I'm good at is getting good people to work together. I'm a pretty smart guy. I can understand this stuff. So, but I wasn't, and I did come up with a few predictive algorithms, so that was fine. So it wasn't my mathematical genius, but I think people respected me because I was a good scientist. So they said, well, he may act stupid, but we know he's really smart.
More from John Ewing.
Of course, I knew he was super rich, and it was hard to ignore that when you were on his boat or on his private plane or other things. But that was not always. He was always a mathematician. He loved being able to talk mathematics, even if it was just to sort of say, I 25 years ago, I would have been able to work on this problem. Now it's just beyond me. He was always fond of saying, he'd forgotten most of the mathematics that he ever learned. But he would also take the time to sort of explain what a connection was and to sort of talk about some mathematical puzzle or something like that. He loved talking mathematics, and he loved the fact that he was a mathematician. And I think that always came through and overwhelmed the finance part of things, at least when he and I were talking.
Do you feel there was a part of him that would love to have stayed a pure mathematician rather than going into finance?
Well, that's for sure. He was extraordinarily proud of the work that he'd done. He talked about Chern-Simons and the fact that it became really famous. He won the Veblen Prize at the AMS, and at one point, he had somehow lost the citation for this prize that he'd won back in the 70s for some of his early work on minimal surfaces. And I went and found the old, or parts of the old citation that was there for him. He loved that fact. He really loved it. On the other hand, having known Jim for the little time that I did, it was clear that he never would have stayed a mathematician. I mean, there's some people that just sort of keep doing mathematics into their 80s. Or Jim was restless. He was always interested in new things. So while I think he loved and was really proud of the mathematics, I think he himself knew that he never would have just stayed a pure mathematician all his life. It just wasn't in his personality that he could have done that.
Would you trade any or all of your business success for being the man who cracked the Riemann hypothesis or something like that?
No, that's a good question. Would I trade that for? Well, I probably trade some of it. I mean, for the Riemann hypothesis, it would certainly guess, be a thrill to solve the Riemann hypothesis.
Now, this is David Eisenbud. He's the former director of SLMath, or MSRI. That's the institute in Berkeley I mentioned earlier.
He could be very focused on a goal, and he was very good at, in my view, at assessing talent in people. He believed very much in data. He had worked with lots of data as a cryptographer, and that influenced his approach to trading very much. So one of the things which I think is well known about Renaissance is that they collect huge amounts of data and have a whole division devoted to cleaning it and curating it in one way or another. So he was very data focused. Renaissance does not trade on people's understanding of the market. It trades on computer generated signals, which are gotten by sorting through immense amounts of data. That's my understanding. And of course, they don't say anything about what they do in public, but that's what I gather. Other places let the traders inject a certain amount of their judgment into the matter, and Renaissance not. There are now other firms that do that too, maybe many, but at the time I may have been the first, or in any case, one of the few going in that direction seriously. So that was an initial success. And then his recruiting was interesting. He avoided, he told me, anybody with a business degree. He wanted scientists and especially astronomers, he said, because they're used to working with data without being able to make experiments. So they look at what comes in through the telescopes and they have to do something with it. And he felt that was analogous to his view of the stock market.
My algorithm has always been, you get smart people together, you give them a lot of freedom, create an atmosphere where everyone talks to everyone else. They're not hiding in a corner with their own little thing. They talk to everybody else. And you provide the best infrastructure, the best computers and so on that people can work with, and make everyone partners. So that was the model that we used in Renaissance. So we would bring in smart folks, and they didn't know anything about finance, but they learned.
Did you ever get the impression that some part of him still wished he was one of you and had stuck with mathematics?
Well, he kept doing mathematics, actually, quite a long time. He collaborated with Jeff Cheeger in fundamental ways. He collaborated with Dennis Sullivan, both very powerful mathematicians, and they proved some good theorems together. His most recent work was about differential cohomology, something he had invented long before. And he sort of put the finishing touches on what he'd done. I think that his late work was not as successful as his early work, and he felt that too, I think. But he certainly kept thinking about mathematics quite late. He told me at a certain point that he had stopped, and he would ask me from time to time, was I continuing? Because he's not so much older than I am.
Yeah, of course he was a smart guy. That came through when you talked to him. He understood things. He understood people too, really, really well, which again is not always a mathematician's trait here to be savvy about things like that. But the biggest thing that was unmistakable with Jim was that he was curious about everything, and especially science, of course. And now I'm going way beyond mathematics. I mean, he wanted to know about things and he got really interested in them. And he would, at the drop of a hat, start talking about some new discovery in genetics or something else about the way epigenetics was now affecting things. He was curious about everything. It may sound a little surprising, but somehow I think people that are hyper curious in that way actually are curious about the world around them and actually very successful because of that. I think curiosity is an undervalued trait when it comes to success, even in finance. I mean, so very often people in Jim's position, at a position of power and wealth, and I think become a little self-absorbed. Jim was never self-absorbed. He really made you feel that when you were with him, especially one-on-one, that he was talking to you, that, you were full partners in the conversation. Again, I will say Jim, especially in his later years, had the habit of nodding off sometimes. So in meetings, for example, in an afternoon, by the way, he that trait is shared by many of us, I'm afraid, as we get older. But he would nod off in meetings. But, and this one's a little embarrassing to say, we met very regularly, once every week or 2 weeks, for a long, long time. And we just come in and talk about how Math for America was doing and other things. But it was a one-on-one meeting. I found out that if those meetings were in the early afternoon, as the two of us were talking, he would nod off. Now that's very embarrassing because it says something about what I was saying and my ability to keep people's attention. But he would definitely nod off. And after a while, I learned that I had to be brave and I'd have to sort of lean over and say something to him about waking up. And much to my surprise, even though I am telling you he was napping, he would know where the conversation was, right? He somehow, in the back of his mind, he'd been processing some of the stuff here. But so in that sense, and he was famous, I think, for this, of sort of nodding off when things were going on.
I will tell you a story. I went to a symposium for his celebrating the anniversary of his Chern-Simons discovery, and they'd flown a special speaker in from across the country at his request to summarize the work, who he felt would do the best job summarizing the work. And he did. It was a fantastic talk. And at one point I looked over at Jim's table to see if he was enjoying the talk. He was asleep.
Yeah. So this was awesome. He would always sit in the front row of the auditorium when we were having a talk. And of course, you could tell the speaker had come in. Jim was this famous guy sitting in the front row. The speaker was looking right at Jim. And so often you would look over and there was Jim sort of nodding off, and you could tell you could see this chagrin on the speaker's face that he was sleeping, but not for long. And he would wake up, and then, as I say, it would often be the fact that you discover he was actually processing what was going on.
Andrew Millis is a physicist at Columbia University, but also another of Jim Simons' recruits, currently serving as managing director of the Flatiron Institute.
Well, I came across him before I met him, actually. I was serving as department chair at my university, Columbia University, and we were in the very, very last stages of trying to recruit an eminent theoretical physicist, Michael Douglas. We had basically come to a complete agreement about, the offer he would get. He was ready to sign, and the day before everything was going to be done, he calls me up and says, "Have you ever heard of Jim Simons?" And then he says, "Well, I have an offer to go to the Simons Center for Geometry and Physics in Stony Brook, which Jim had set up. And, I'm still very interested in Columbia, and if you can come close to matching the offer, then I'll think about it." And there was no way. I mean, in particular, he was being given the opportunity really to help build a part of the Institute with, a large number of positions to fill and so on. And we just couldn't match that. So anyway, that was my first encounter with Jim Simons' name, I'm embarrassed to say.
Oh, no, not a happy memory then.
No, and then a couple of years later, after I'd stepped down as chair, I got a call, I think first from David Eisenbud, asking if I would be interested in working with him and Jim Simons in establishing the Math and Physical Sciences Grants Program of the Simons Foundation. So that was probably in 2011, and that's when I really first came to know Jim. Once I understood what was going on and it was clear I might be interested, then I went and talked to Jim in his office, and we discussed what his vision for the foundation was, how he wanted to organize things, and what would be interesting for the Math and Physical Sciences unit to actually do. I was astounded actually at how, let's say, broadly knowledgeable he was about things in science and about how committed he was to basic science, and also how good a listener he was. I mean, and this was a constant all through my time of working with him. Well, he was the decider at the Simons Foundation, but he had a gift I've never seen before or since for assembling good people to talk to, listening carefully to what they have to say, asking the right questions. It was really quite impressive. There are other people of that stature who were kind of in the, when I want your opinion, I'll tell it to you mode of operation. And Jim was as far from that as anybody I've ever seen.
He was very humorous. He liked to tell jokes, often vaguely relevant jokes to his condition or other people's conditions. I can tell you one if you like. Two couples are going out to dinner together. Two men are sitting in front, two women in the back. The driver is the host, and the man who's coming along asked him, "Oh, by the way, what was the name of the restaurant we're going to again?" And so he says, "Well, name a flower." The guy says, "How about daisy?" "No, try again." "Lilac?" "No, try again." "Rose." "Okay." Then he turns to the back and says, "Rosie, what's the name of that restaurant we're going to?"
Okay.
So he liked jokes a lot. He was a very sociable person, really.
Yeah.
He liked to have people around him all the time. And he liked to have scientists around him in particular. And that was part of the motivation, I think, truly, for developing the Flatiron Institute, which is a huge collection of scientists right on his doorstep. And he was involved with them all the time.
And he created an atmosphere at the foundation where it really, everybody down to, the essentially clerks and financial people, and indeed the security and the custodial staff, really all felt that they were sort of part of his extended family, his extended work family, and all contributing to the mission of the foundation. And he, knew what everybody was doing. Basically, everybody had the sense that he hired great people and let them get on with it at every level. And that he was, while requiring very high standards, and he was basically on your side and completely supportive. So everybody really felt in a real way kind of part of a family and a team doing something bigger than they were.
He was intensely proud of Math for America. And I think that was genuine. I mean, I think he really thought that he was giving back to society. Of course, we had 1,000 teachers in the program. I can tell you every one of those teachers adored Jim. They were so tickled when they would be at some meeting somewhere or at our annual gala or something, and they got to shake Jim Simon's hand. And so it meant a lot to them, and he knew it meant a lot to them. And so I think it gave them the kind of respect that teachers often don't get.
So he didn't just tip in the millions of dollars. He would come along and talk to them and shake their hands and meet the teachers.
Yeah. Oh, he loved being involved in things. So we have an annual gala every single year where we bring everybody, about 1,500 people, teachers, their guests. And he thrived at that. He really loved it. As I said, he was intensely proud, and I think genuinely really appreciated the teachers. I don't know if you know this, but 2 of his grandchildren are high school teachers. One of whom got a degree, PhD at MIT, and then went into teaching physics in high schools. And I can't tell you how many times Jim would tell me about his 2 teacher grandchildren. He really was proud of that fact.
Like anyone, Jim Simon's life was not without challenges and heartbreaks. In 1996, his son Paul died in a cycling accident at the age of 34. 7 years later, his son Nicholas also died in an accident. He drowned. He was 24 years old.
It left him with a kind of intense sadness. It wasn't, it wasn't morose, but you could tell there was a kind of sadness there in his life.
It stuck with him very much. Those tragedies were a real presence in his life and in Marilyn's life too.
He did recognize it, bring it up occasionally. I think it changed. It probably made him maybe more human. I don't know exactly what that means, but more down to earth than he might otherwise have been. It just sort of focused him on the lessons of life. I think it would be hard not to. They both of them were tragic. I mean, I'm not sure it's any easier when you lose somebody to disease. It's bound to sort of change you, I think. So yeah, it did affect him.
I was lucky enough to meet Jim a few times, and I remember before I met him the first time, like half an hour before, you leaned over to me and said, "By the way, Jim doesn't wear socks." And that's one of the only things you told me about him. And like every time I met him since, the first thing I always did was I would look down at his feet. And true enough, he always had lovely leather loafers on, but he was never ever wearing socks. And if you go to his Wikipedia page, it says there's just this random sentence amongst all the honors and the wealth and the glory and that. It just says he doesn't wear socks.
Yes.
Did you ever ask him about that?
Yeah, he liked to keep his feet cool, I think.
Yeah, sure. We made jokes about it all the time. I made a little safety video for the auditorium at one time. When we opened up the auditorium, we made a safety video that was a bit of a spoof. Anyway, it was supposed to be funny. I deliberately, in the safety video, didn't wear socks. So, and occasionally at events like that, I would not wear socks, which, by the way, is intensely uncomfortable. It's not a great thing to do.
He probably had slightly more expensive shoes on than you.
Yes, I'm quite sure. And he was used to it. But no, he never wore socks.
Well, that was that. And he smoked a lot. That was the other.
I mean, he was, people around him were always trying to get him to give up smoking, including me, by the way. But he couldn't do it. For one thing, he just said he couldn't think, all his life when he was doing mathematics, he had a cigarette in his hand and he was at the blackboard and coffee in the other hand. Actually, if you have a cigarette in one hand and coffee in the other, it's a little hard to work at a blackboard, but we would go out to dinner, and this happened repeatedly in many places. We go out to dinner, fancy restaurant, small or large group, didn't make any difference. Towards the end of the meal, Jim would inevitably light up a cigarette. Now, in New York City, you cannot light up a cigarette in a restaurant. And the waiters, of course, knowing that it was Jim, you could see them. They'd all huddle around and they'd sort of talk to one another and try to decide what was it they were going to do. And finally, they'd bring over some big shot waiter who would say, "Excuse me, sir, but you're not allowed to smoke in here." And Jim always did the same thing. He would say, oh, I didn't know that. And he's still puffing away here. And they said, "Oh, well, bring me an ashtray and I'll put it out." Now, no restaurant has ashtrays anymore. So the poor guy would race off trying to find an ashtray somewhere. Well, Jim is puffing away and smoking like that. And he'd be near the end of a cigarette. Finally, they'd come back with an ashtray and he'd put out the same cigarette. But he did this over and over and over again. And it pretty nearly always worked, right? I mean, almost no one can come up instantly with an ashtray. Smart people would just bring over a plate and have him put it out. But it was Jim, and it was just the way he was. And so smoking was just part of him.
You obviously, as you said, you worked alongside him, but then later on, you also went to him for money. Yes. You famously got a very large endowment from him for MSRI, now SLMath. What was that? What was he like to deal with on that side of the fence?
He was cautious and, liked to think about it before saying yes to anything. In a pinch, he could be very decisive. For example, when we were building the addition to MSRI, what was then MSRI? We made the plans, we had estimates. Then when the actual bids came in from the people who were going to do the work, they were considerably higher than we had gotten estimates of. And so I had a serious shortfall. The whole project was a little bit in jeopardy. And I remember a very nervous phone call to Jim saying, "Look, this is what's happened. And I need $1 million from you." And he said, "I'll think about it. Tell you tomorrow." And tomorrow I got the $1 million.
He had a great gift for listening. He was clearly the one in charge and was made the final call on everything. But I guess the right way to say it is that, at least every decision I saw him take was the result of a process. And he got lots of, he got advice from all the appropriate places and considered the options in various ways. And then decided what he wanted to do. So whether or not you completely agreed with it, you had the sense that there was a process and it was a reasonable decision. And that, your views were taken seriously in the process. So, also I would say that partly he and Marilyn Simons together set up the foundation. I mean, the founding story, which was, before my time there, was that it was really started at Marilyn's impetus and it lived in a shoebox in her dressing room for the first 5 or 7 years of its existence. But I think they really wanted to put some structure into their philanthropy. So he really wanted to create a structure where he was not making every individual decision, but instead there was an entity that did in a broader way the things that he thought were worthwhile doing.
Here's another thing that occurred to me in the random facts direction. When Numberphile reached 1 million viewers, I'm sure you remember.
1 million subscribers.
1 million subscribers, sorry.
Yes.
Right. Let me be fair. So when you reached 1 million, you said you wanted to do something special. And your idea was to be in a room with 1 million $1 bills. This reminds me a little bit of Charlie Chaplin playing with the globe, but that's another story.
I wanted to see what 1 million $1 notes look like. Yeah.
That's right. A lot, it turns out. So I said, well, maybe Jim would consider making that possible. And we asked Jim, and he said, sure, that's a great idea. What a wonderful lark. It turned out to be a much harder thing to do than Jim or anybody had.
Well, we didn't think a bank would help us, but we thought if Jim Simons picked up the phone and said, get 1 million $1 notes for me, they would say, yes, sir. When do you want it?
Even Jim was refused the privilege of coming into the vault to play with 1 million $1 notes.
Well, that's all he seemed to remember about me. Whenever I would meet him, it would be like, oh, here's Brady, he makes Numberphile. And he'd be go, oh, you're the guy that wanted the $1 million. Maybe it irked him that he couldn't get it. So I was like a pebble in his shoe.
So he asked his wonderful assistant, Kim, to make it happen. And Kim and Rachel, the other assistant, worked on this for a while, and they figured out lots of logistics. It would take a couple of armored cars to bring it to the foundation. Maybe the elevators weren't strong enough to carry it all up in one go. They would, it was incredibly complicated to bring about. And ultimately, one of them said, we've got to leave this off. This is just too ridiculous.
There are better things to do.
But Jim was game, and that was typical of Jim. He was game for an interesting idea, whether it be a new way of supporting mathematicians or gathering $1 million for a joke.
For the record, I just want to say, I just wanted to borrow the $1 million for half an hour and give it back.
Okay, fair enough.
I wasn't asking him for $1 million.
He was probably much more adventurous and prone to take risks than most of us. And he really did have a broader vision of what's possible. He didn't become rich by accident. He had an idea, which I'm only very dimly aware of, about things you could do to make lots of money in the markets. The legend is that he understood from his time at the Institute for Defense Analysis working on codes that showed him the power of computers in analyzing very large data sets. And he was the one that had the vision of using that to make progress in finance.
Were there ever things you saw when you were with him that you thought, wow, that's amazing? Like, it must be amazing to be a billionaire.
Well, his greatest luxury, in which I got to participate a little bit, was his boat. He has a big yacht.
Yeah, a boat is probably understating it somewhat, but yes, it's a huge super yacht.
It's not as big as some people's super yachts, but it's pretty big, and it's special, I think, in that it's first of all, its name is the Archimedes. It's decorated with Greek things, some of them made in the present, but some real antiquities as well. Amazing sculptures and art. He was one thing I haven't mentioned, he was a great collector of art, in particular modern American art, and very knowledgeable about it.
David, we want to hear about the boat.
So another thing that he spent some money on, although this is small in comparison, was a private jet. And once when I was flying, I forget in which direction with him, between San Francisco and New York, he leaned over and he said to me, would you like to borrow my boat for a week? And Marilyn leaned over and said, say yes. I didn't have any hesitation about that. So the boat Sleep 16 has a permanent crew of 17. So I got to invite 14 of my closest friends to spend 10 days on the boat with me.
Whereabouts were you? Where'd you go?
In the Caribbean. We went around. The crew, of course, knew far more about the situation than I did. And so they helped plan, or they planned really, an itinerary touching at some of the more beautiful islands.
This is the only yacht of that size I've had any experience with, so I don't have any basis for comparison. But like everything else he did, it was very well thought out. Everything was of very high quality. it was clear that he loved it and that it was built and used to go places. I mean, it wasn't just a toy. It wasn't a thing to show off. He had it. I'm not sure how deeply he was involved in the design, but he clearly selected it to be useful in the sense that he could, when the Northwest Passage opened up, he could go around from Alaska, around across the top and back down through Nova Scotia. So it was, in that sense, it was a somewhat working thing, but it was very comfortable to be on, I will say.
I had lunch with him in February. He was a much reduced Jim. He had nurses there and was being cared for wonderfully well, but it was hard to see him in that condition. So it was not a surprise, but I was very sad about it. I still am. He was really one of my late career mentors. This relationship near the end of my career was very important to me.
Jim was, I can't say he was a father figure because we were only 6 years different in age, but Jim was just an incredibly smart, incredibly nice man. Had his flaws like every other human being, but he certainly changed my life in the sense that, and pretty late in my life, I'm going to say, I turned 80 this year. He changed people around him, made them better, and left a lot of really great things, institutions around that will live for a long time to come. So I don't know. I just think of Jim as larger than life, but also incredibly human. I mean, he was just a nice guy. That sounds pretty trite, but Jim was just a nice man.
Do you give your money to basic research because you feel somehow indebted to it for your own success, or do you do it just out of like a belief, or do you feel like you're giving something back to us, to what gave something to you?
Well, that's an interesting question. I do it because it feels good. I like science. I like to see it flourish. I like to be around scientists. I like to learn some new things. And my wife feels the same way. She loves science. We're very happy to do this. Do I feel I'm giving back? Not especially. I'm pleased mostly with the way my career has gone. So would I trade part of it for something? I don't know. I've never looked back and said, I wish, at least in business, I wish I hadn't done that, or I wish I had done this and not that, whatever it is. I've never looked back that way.